expertise of Dr. Reugg, and so we're thrilled to have her come and tell us about her work. Dr. Reugg is a research scientist. She's a lecturer also at UC Santa Cruz, but she's also an adjunct faculty member at the Center for Tropical Research and the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability in UCLA. She goes down there from time to time to work with her colleagues. And her research interests, as you will see from her talk, conservation genetics of migratory songbirds. She's also done conservation genetics of whales in collaboration with Stanford, and migration and speciation, as well as the evolution and ecology of birdsong. So, fantastic bird expert. So, welcome.
Excellent. Well, it's really fun for me to be here to tell you a little bit about my research and get to meet sort of Emily's home institution, and hopefully maybe have the chance to engage with some of you after the talk. So the main thing I'm going to be talking about today is my work on using molecular, specifically sort of whole genome approaches for developing markers that we can use to track migratory birds. And this is of interest in the conservation community because we can utilize DNA in a single feather, which is a non-invasive way of monitoring these often declining populations. But before I get into the specifics of this research project, I thought I'd give a brief introduction, sort of to give you a feel for the kinds of questions that I work on and the kind of science that I do. So the general motivation behind all of the work that I do is trying to understand the mechanisms that generate biological diversity, and then use this information, use this knowledge to inform conservation efforts. So I work at multiple timescales. Oftentimes I'm looking sort of deep into evolutionary history to understand the mechanisms that generate the biological diversity we see today. And then oftentimes we'll use this, like as in the case of tracking migratory birds in the present day, to help inform conservation and management efforts. And the approach I use is integrative. I combine the areas of evolutionary biology, ecology, and animal behavior in order to understand population process through both space and time. And I use both a combination of avian field techniques and population genetics, which is now rapidly becoming the field of population genomics as we sort of harness these next generation sequencing technologies and begin sequencing DNA of the entire genome rather than just small fragments. And as was mentioned in the introduction, in the past, as a postdoc at Stanford University, I worked with Steve Columbi at the Hopkins Marine Lab to try and use genetics in order to understand and inform the conservation genetics of baleen whales. I worked on both Antarctic minke and North Atlantic humpback whales. And the main question we were trying to address with this research is how many whales were there before whaling? And so what we were doing is to try and use information in the signature of the DNA about the amount of diversity in a population, and use this to back calculate sort of how many whales you would have expected before human intervention. Another area of research, again, that I'm not going to talk about today, but in case you're interested and want to ask me about later, is the ecology and evolutionary biology of birdsong. And most recently, I've been working on this with an undergrad at UC Santa Cruz, Chelsea Holman. And the question that we've been trying to address is, what is the role of ecology and genetics in driving vocal diversity in songbirds? And then one of the big questions that I've worked on as a PhD student, this was the topic of my dissertation as a PhD student at UC Berkeley, just over in the other part of the Bay. And I still work a lot in this area right now although the sort of conservation genetics realm, it dominates most of my time and energy. But I'm fascinated by understanding the process of speciation, or the formation of multiple species from one, and specifically, what is the role of differences in migratory behavior in this process of speciation? And you may be thinking, like, well, how could migratory behavior play a role at all in the process of speciation? Well, there's actually a lot of research to suggest that when you have differences in migratory behavior, this creates a difference in the timing of breeding between birds, which is going to affect mate choice. There is also some research suggesting that when you have a hybrid between two individuals that have a different migratory program, so a different genetic makeup that tells this bird to migrate to South America and it tells that bird to migrate to Central America, and at different times, when the parents of those two create an offspring, the offspring has a mixed up migratory program which can be maladaptive. So both of these things are thought to potentially contribute to the formation of new species in migratory birds, and that's another area which I'm not going to talk about today, but I thought I would give you a little tantalizing tidbit in case you're interested in asking about it later. The question I am going to focus on today is this one, and this has been literally the question that has driven at the core of my research since the very beginning, since I was a master's student at San Francisco State University, back, well, a long time ago. And this question is, where do populations of migratory birds found breeding in North America spend the non-breeding season? Okay, and it seems like a pretty simple question. You see birds in your backyard in the summer months, which is the breeding season, and then those birds disappear during the winter months. For those of us that are trying to develop conservation strategies for these migratory birds, we want to know where the particular populations that spend the breeding season in different areas of the range spend the non-breeding season, because if you can imagine, if there's disturbance in one part of the range, you need to know how that's affecting the birds, the population trends that you're seeing in another part of the range. So this question is motivated by population declines in many species of migratory bird, including this data here from the Breeding Bird Survey, which is a national survey to monitor populations of migratory birds. And this data for the yellow-breasted chat depicts population declines over several decades. In fact, it's thought that nearly half of the migratory songbird species in North America are currently declining. However, the question remains, where are migrant populations limited? Where are the stressors? Is it things on the breeding grounds? At the migratory stopover points? Or on the wintering grounds? And at each one of these locations, birds are subject to a number of stressors, including habitat destruction, predation by house cats, avian diseases, and overlaying all of these is the current and potential future effect of global climate change. And so those of us that study migratory birds, what we understand is identifying these connections between the breeding and wintering areas is crucial for developing effective conservation strategies. So again, if we capture this yellow warbler on its wintering grounds in the Yucatan region of Mexico, and we notice there's been habitat disturbance near its wintering range, we know how this may be influencing population trajectories that we're seeing on its breeding grounds. So past approaches to what they call link breeding and wintering populations of migratory birds have included bird banding. So the bird banding program began in the U.S. In North America in the 1920s. And this was a Herculean effort to track and monitor migratory birds. And it's yielded an enormous amount of very valuable information about populations. Especially for sort of larger bodied species, where the recapture rates, so you put a bird band, who knows what bird banding is? Okay. Okay, so let me just, okay, yeah, let's tell them. Okay, so bird banding is, there's banding stations, and I'll show you a map of a location of where a lot of the bird banding stations are in North America. But for those of you that don't know, you should go check it out, see if you can find it. Well, ask Emily, maybe she'll take you out. She works at a bird banding station. And what happens at these banding stations is people are capturing migratory birds. They're putting on metal leg bands. They no longer look like that. Those are sort of ancient leg bands. They put these little metal leg bands even on tiny little hummingbirds and passerines, all the way up to, raptors. And then they hope to recapture that bird sometime in the future, or if a bird is found dead with a metal leg band on it, they hope to be able, that the person who finds it will have the wherewithal to report that record to the National Bird Banding Laboratory, which is controlled by the U.S. Geological Survey. Okay, and so, but you can imagine, number one, how infrequent it is that you're actually going, there's millions and millions of birds, right? Now, the chances that you're going to recapture that bird are pretty low to start with. Oh, and the chances that the person who finds the dead bird is going to actually know to call that tag in are even smaller. But it's actually been quite successful for sort of ducks, larger waterfowl, raptors, where recapture rates are higher, or in some cases, you can actually see a color band anyway from, like with the California condor, you can actually read the band just with your binoculars. But for smaller bodied species, such as the songbirds that I primarily focus on, this program, in terms of long-term tracking, has met with some limitations. So there's been, as of 2011, when I last downloaded the data, there was roughly 33 million songbirds banded since the start of the bird banding program. And as of 2011, there were only 420,000 total recaptures across all species. And these numbers are much lower for many of the species. So for Wilson's warblers, which is the species I'm going to talk to you about a lot today, that's this bird right here, there were only 3 recaptures. So that's not a whole lot of information if you're trying to develop a map and an understanding of where particular populations are going. And so this overall translates to a recapture rate of less than 1.3%. And this led myself and my colleagues who've been working on this problem for quite a while to ask the question, how can we get tracking information from every banded bird? So you have this massive network of banding stations and monitoring stations all over the Western Hemisphere. A lot of effort is going into capturing these birds. And wouldn't it be great if there was some way we could actually get tracking information from every bird that hits a mist net? So our approach to doing this has been the development of what I call high-resolution molecular tags. And again, this methodology focuses on information contained within a single feather. As long as you successfully pull one feather before the bird is released or escapes, you have very valuable information about that bird. Some advantages of this are that you can get information from every bird that hits a mist net as long as you get that feather. The feathers can be collected with minimal impact, and so when we're working on declining species, in some cases endangered species, threatened species, it's very important that we're not putting heavy tracking devices on them that could potentially affect that bird's survival. And we work very closely on this project with the Institute for Bird Populations in Point Reyes, California, that helps monitor the network of banding stations all over the Western Hemisphere. And they have done studies showing that there's no difference in survival between birds that have had the tail feather pulled versus those that have not. So that gives us confidence that this is a good non-invasive methodology. And the other nice thing about this, which is coming into focus especially recently, as I'll talk about in the very end of my talk, is that you can use this methodology to trace individuals that are found as carcasses because they were either subject to collisions with things like cell phone towers or wind turbines. And most recently, there are these things at solar institutions. Has anybody heard about streamers? No. So there are these solar facilities going in, which is great because, alternative energy is, we have to have it in order to preserve biological diversity on a grand scale. But we're still working out the kinks, and what's been found is oftentimes the birds are attracted to these solar facilities, and we don't know why, but in some cases the heat at the solar facility actually causes the birds to combust, and all that is left is like feather spots, as they say. So we're trying to understand the impact of things like the solar panels, and this is not solar panels on your house, this is utility scale solar, yeah.